All right, hello everybody. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the life history of wildlife in the wintertime in the Southern Appalachian Mountains. So sometimes when you go outside in the wintertime, everything looks really just gray and barren, or even when it's beautiful and snowy, it just doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of wildlife compared to the summertime when there are all kinds of singing birds and insects and butterflies and flowers. And sometimes it's hard to really think about where they go in the wintertime. We know that they hibernate, we know that they fly south, but to really understand how they survive mountain winters is a really important way to be able to understand wildlife and maybe find some really cool things out in the wintertime when you wouldn't think those things would be out there. So I'd like to start off by looking at two example species that are very different in the ways that they survive the wintertime. The first one is the yellow map lichen, which grows all over the Roan Balds on little rock outcrops and on the sides of the mountain, anywhere there's exposed rock on top of the mountain. But anyway, it basically survives winter by just existing. It's such a simple life form that it's able to withstand the cold. It just has to put up with it. There's no part of this lichen that can really physically get damaged by cold or snow or ice. And it kind of serves as a crust to allow other stuff to thrive. On the other hand, we have the Canada warbler, which is a neotropical warbler, which means it's a tropical bird. It can come up here and survive in the warm summer temperatures, but it can't live through the winter at all. There's not even a single instance of this bird showing up in the winter successfully, at least in the Southern Appalachians, because they have to get out. If they don't, then they risk dying. They'll freeze to death because their food sources, which are small insects, also live here in the summertime as well, and they can't find those in the wintertime. So they have to fly hundreds of miles, sometimes thousands, to get to their wintering grounds in Central and South America. So two very different stories that are going on, but these two organisms occur within feet of each other in the summer at the same time. So it's just a little bit of a food for thought about the variety. Also, to kind of set the stage, let's look at a couple of the things they're going to have to endure. Anything that stays in the mountains for the wintertime will have to endure this. This first obstacle to winter survival is called hoarfrost. And on Roan Mountain is one of the best local places to see it in action, because hoarfrost is when water vapors crossing the mountain and the cold, windswept trees and ground and rocks are basically frozen already, and the water vapor that hits it from clouds blowing up from the lowlands, they hit those surfaces and freeze these beautiful little frost feathers all over everything. But if you're on the surface of the ground and hoarfrost is starting to happen overnight, you'll get frozen if you're not hidden or somehow otherwise resilient to the frost. So it's a very real and dangerous thing that our species in the mountains will have to survive. So there's some examples of it. You can see where it's frozen directly to a rock, to a mountain alder bush, to the spruce tree. Everything's covered with it after a night of freezing temperatures. And also, a very common sign on the mountain is what's called krumholtz in Swedish, but it's been adopted on the Appalachian Trail. But it basically refers to the little tiny trees. You get really big spruce forest trees and red spruce and Fraser fir, but on the mountain, both those trees become stunted when they're out exposed to the wind and the weather and the elements. It's very hard for them to grow any taller than that, both without getting destroyed by the wind or the cold or something else that comes along and attacks them. So you see all these adorable little, basically bonsai trees. They're not that small, but some are just 6-8 feet maximum, and they're just as old as the forest trees, but their growth is restricted because they grow out in these elements. So with all that considered, it's kind of hard to believe that there are things that are able to survive this, but there are, and there are lots of species that figure out ways to survive quite successfully on the mountain. It is a biodiversity hotspot. So another way to tell really how cold it is up on the mountain is to look at our native rhododendron species. These do not lose their leaves. They're a deciduous bush, or great rhododendrons even get to tree size, but the catawba and the great rhododendron both grow on the mountain. Usually the great is in the state park, and as you go up, you get the catawba rhododendron. But On a warm day that's above freezing, the leaves are usually flat and just kind of hanging out kind of horizontally. On a cold day, the leaf will droop down and fold up. And if you see that photo on the screen of great rhododendrons along the Doe River in the state park, you can see that the leaves have just shriveled up and they've shrunken into, um, they look dead. They look withered and wilted, and it looks like somebody sprayed them with herbicide or something. But as soon as it gets warmer and the sun comes out and the snow starts melting, the leaves will fold back to the picture in the upper left corner of the screen, which are just ordinary great rhododendron leaves. They go from this folded state, like those frozen Catawba rhododendron leaves, to the open rhododendron leaves that you would normally see in the summertime. So you can actually use the graph up on the top right to determine the temperature based on either of the species leaf fold and how folded it is. So there's a little trick for you to know just how cold it is or how warm it is. And there's a lot of stuff that limits its activity or is more active due to the specific temperature in the wintertime. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So now let's talk about birds. The Canada warbler is kind of weak, and it has to move south and fast in the fall to get away from the cold temperatures. But a lot of birds are able to resist the cold temperatures of the mountains, including the Carolina chickadee, the tufted titmouse, the white-breasted nuthatch, and the downy woodpecker. And together they form a little mixed flock that travels throughout the forests searching for food, whether it's seeds or insects. They're very versatile omnivores when it comes to that. They can eat bugs, they can eat seeds, they can eat berries. There are a whole lot of food sources for these particular birds, and that's one of the reasons they're able to survive. So the chickadee is probably one of the smallest of the nucleus species. This little small group of just 4 or 5 species, depending on which area you're in, that fly around together and basically help each other out. And the Carolina chickadee takes the outer edges of branches, the little twigs and the little, basically the very tips of the branches, and that's where it feeds. So it takes a specific role in this mixed flock. The tufted titmouse, on the other hand, is going to go further in the tree to the middle of the branch. And together they kind of fly from tree to tree, and they're able to move from tree to tree much more quickly and cover it more thoroughly because they're working together. The chickadee's taking the outside of the branches, and the tufted titmouse is taking the inside of the branches, so they can go through the trees. Actually, if there aren't any chickadees, if there aren't any tufted titmice, the chickadee can actually fly back, and they'll choose the middle of the branches because there's usually more insect life or seeds or berries that they can find somewhere by scouting across the middle of the tree branches rather than the outer edges. So that's the kind of the prize spot. And tufted titmice are kind of bullies to keep that spot. But it always interests me how in the world they find their food. It's one thing that they are still here and that they can survive the winter, but how do they find the food? Usually their body temperature is around 105 degrees Fahrenheit. So they've got to eat and eat and eat and continually eat, or else they die. They freeze to death very quickly because they're so small. Well, actually, they have a secret weapon, and I'll show you an example. This bird is the northern harrier, and it also has this secret weapon. And the secret weapon is ultraviolet vision. They can see the reflections of ultraviolet light. In the case of the chickadee and the tufted titmouse, they're the insects on tree branches and the little cocoons of moths and things that are stuffed inside the bark. But the northern harrier also has this ultraviolet vision, and they use it to find trails of rodent urine over grasslands like the roan balls. And so a harrier will fly over the grassland. They have a long tail and very long wings, and they kind of teeter over the grass. And as soon as they see a rodent trail, they'll actually follow it until they find the rodent or find another trail and catch a rodent. So they spend a lot of time skimming over the grasslands to look for things moving down in the grass. And when they see it, they swoop down with really long legs and just attack it. And sorry about that. That's how they find their food. And actually, let's move on to another ultraviolet vision capability bird, which is the white-breasted nuthatch. And white-breasted nuthatches actually begin nesting in the winter. And you can see in the photo, there's a pair building a nest in an old tree cavity. But white-breasted nuthatches live in the middle of the tree. So they circle upwards along the tree trunk rather than they actually go both up and down. But they and that'll be important because I'm going to show you a couple more birds that they work together with. But white-breasted nuthatches move up around the tree and basically fulfill the same role. And then the downy woodpecker goes straight up the tree. So if there's a nuthatch and a downy woodpecker in the same mixed flock on the center of the tree, because woodpeckers like to stick on the center of the tree, the nuthatch will usually go down in this way, and the downy woodpecker will go up the other way. And it can also hammer into the wood and get insects that none of the other birds would be able to get a hold of. So together, they all basically have a different spot that they take over, and it allows them to have a much more effective feeding strategy, but it also protects them. If there's a hawk like a sharp-shinned or a Cooper's hawk, those are notorious bird eaters. If one of those shows up, they can usually warn each other and go silent so that the hawk can't find where their flock is. They can just dissipate into the trees and then regroup and continue traveling from tree to tree. So they have quite the little winter survival strategy worked out and can handle some extremely cold temperatures on top of the mountain. But other birds know that. So you have all these birds that also live in the area, like the evening grosbeak this year. There were a whole bunch of those really beautiful yellow birds that showed up in the Southern Appalachians this year. And golden crown kinglet's a tiny little bird that eats insects and lives on even farther out on the tips of branches than the chickadee. Evening grosbeaks mainly eat seeds like old box elder, maple seeds, or helicopter seeds that you see there in the trees late into the winter, and sunflower seeds at bird feeders. But mixed flocks will find bird feeders too. And usually if you feed birds, you'll notice that these other species like fox sparrows and even other woodpeckers will start to join these mixed flocks. And soon you get all the nucleus species, but they attract other birds because they want to benefit off of that little situation. And usually they have their own outside roles, even though they might not stick around for as long. So the mixed flock is probably the best strategy for finding winter birds out in the mountain forests in the middle of winter, because they're almost a guaranteed survival for birds that would otherwise probably not make it. And then, of course, the Roan Highlands have some special birds that are part of these mixed flocks. And these include the Southern Appalachian brown creeper and the Southern Appalachian winter wren, which only live in this little pencil-thin Southern Appalachian ridge line that has the Balsam Mountains, or Roan Mountain, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, White Top Mountain, and Grandfather Mountain, places like that. So these spruce fir forests support these birds, but they'll go down with the other mixed flocks in the wintertime, go a little bit farther down the mountain to the state park and to the surrounding counties of East Tennessee and North Carolina. So you get all these beautiful little strange birds, like the brown creeper goes up around a tree like a woodpecker, but it's a much daintier, more fragile bird. And they're a truly amazing species to see in the winter, but they blend right in with the bark, and they actually nest in little hut-like crevices in there in the summertime. But they're very secretive. You can barely hear their call, but they join the mixed flocks and they go around the tree as well. The red-breasted nuthatch will actually usually find the opposite direction of a white-breasted nuthatch on the same tree if they happen to be in the same mixed flock for a time. But red-breasted nuthatches kind of prefer conifers, and white-breasted prefer deciduous trees. So you'll usually find each of the nuthatches are more numerous in their favorite habitat, but they'll show up in either. The Southern Appalachian winter wren is basically a mouse. It's the only bird that I've had run under a rock to escape from me instead of just flying away. They're amazingly adept at running across the ground. They have a little tail that sticks straight up. They're about the size of a ping pong ball, so a very tiny little bird, and they nest in tree stumps and in moss on the ground. They're very loud, and they're a good bird to have around in a mixed flock, because even though they don't go high up in the trees, they're on the ground and they can warn the other birds really quickly. And they have a beautiful song in the summertime, but they'll be quiet in the wintertime most of the time for obvious reasons. They're not going to try to nest either. And then the Carolina junco usually stays at the very highest elevations of the mountains. It's got a blue bill to identify it from the northern juncos that migrate south, but it lives up on the mountains as well with these other birds. And together you get all these species, and it creates a huge diversity of mixed flock birds. So moving on from the birds, we happen to have a pretty amazing strategy in insect survival in the wintertime. When I think of insects in the wintertime, I've often heard, they die off, and that happens for a lot of species. They just seem to disappear. All the insects that you see in the summer just are not as numerous as they are in the wintertime. They just go away. And it's really hard to kind of picture where they go. You can think, oh, they laid eggs and they died, then they'll hatch out the next year or something like that. But it's not that simple for a lot of insect species in the mountains, including butterflies. And both these species you see here are very special winter butterfly species. The one on the left is a mourning cloak, and a mourning cloak butterfly belongs to the tortoiseshell family. And tortoiseshell butterflies, they're not really that common, in eastern North America. There aren't very many species, but they have think of it like wires inside of their wings. They have these extra tough wings. Some species are migratory. Mourning cloak isn't. It just has to survive in the wintertime. And they don't pollinate flowers. They find on warm days, they'll wake up and they'll scout for scat or rotten fruit or other organic matter that's just absolutely, they look for nasty stuff rather than flowers. But they fly often in the canopy, and they occur in the summer as well. But in the wintertime, they can simply freeze. And the same thing with this question mark butterfly. And as you can see, the question mark on the right is beautiful when its wings are open, but it can close its wings and look just like a leaf. And that's a really good strategy, because what they do, they'll fly somewhere nice and dry and protected. They'll close their wings to look like a dead leaf, and then they freeze over. But they survive. They don't die. They freeze over. And early in the spring, sometimes even in February, you can start to see these butterflies just fluttering around landing on the side of tree trunks, drinking tree sap. And it's really phenomenal to see them in the winter, and you think, wow, they hatched out early. But no, they've been around the whole winter. And on warm days, you can see them flying around and proving that, yeah, a butterfly can survive winter. They're much tougher than we give them credit for. But both of these species occur on Roan Mountain, and they have to survive the winter up there by doing that. But how do they survive freezing? Well, let's look at these two other insect examples. The first one is the red flat bark beetle. And what they do is they're flatter than almost any other native beetle species that is quite as numerous as they are. And they'll go inside the bark of a dying tree, and that's where they'll spend the winter. They can freeze over under the bark. They've got antifreeze in their system. And that antifreeze is a sugar-based antifreeze. And just like antifreeze you put in a car, it can basically become solid, frozen solid, and these insects just shut down. It's like a computer in sleep mode. And they'll fit under that bark and they'll freeze solid. They'll just be a little disc, and then they'll wake up and they'll go back through the bark again. On the other hand, there are jumping spiders, which also use antifreeze. They go through a process called cold hardening. Whenever it gets cold, they'll basically shrink down and shut down. And so you'll find them in little tiny sleeping bags. A jumping spider doesn't catch prey in a web because they have to do those amazing jumps from leaf to leaf and catch stuff. Have you ever seen one on a picnic table or out in the woods in the summertime? You'll know how adept they are at jumping. But they have those big eyes to see prey, so they don't need to build a web to catch prey. But they do build a web to make a little cozy sleeping bag in the wintertime. They'll build it under a piece of peeling bark, and a bunch of them will usually build it together if it's good habitat, and somewhere where it's kind of dry. And they'll build it and they'll pull it over their head and they'll close it. And you actually open one up in the wintertime, it'll crawl out, and then you can wait for a second, and usually they'll go back inside and pull it back over their head. So it's kind of adorable if you can think of spiders adorable. But they can build those sleeping bags, but they also use the antifreeze. So you have a ton of these adult insects that are surviving the winter. Some survive as eggs, some survive as larvae, some insects even survive as a pupa or like a cocoon or something. But the point is, they all have to use something like antifreeze or otherwise dodge the cold completely by going far enough underground. And a lot of them are able to survive simply by producing something in their body that allows them to freeze over, which is why there's such an impressive insect diversity on Roan Mountain, because they figure out these nice little loopholes to survive the winter weather so they can burst out in the summertime and we can see the beautiful insect biodiversity that we see on the mountain. It's not an insect, but I thought I'd include it here too. But snails. Roan Mountain has a whole lot of land snails, and land snails are really diverse in the mountains. But one of the reasons they're able to do that is to protect themselves from harmful chemicals, from cold weather, of course, and from even from predators and parasites that would otherwise get in their shell. Snails like these dished three-tooth snails will actually coat the front or the aperture of their shell so that nothing can get in there with mucus that'll dry and make a little protective gate right there. They can actually breathe through this screen, but it prevents almost anything else from penetrating the shell. And these were all huddled under a little log in a beaver pond. And they were all gathered together in a little pile. I didn't pile them up like this. They piled themselves up because it's such good habitat. And it looked like they were actually below the freezing line. So these are cheating. And of course, I don't blame them, because if I could find a place that I could handle the winter weather without having to completely freeze over, I probably would too if I was a snail. You definitely don't want to mess with a mountain winter. So usually species will go to the best habitat. So if you happen to know of a little warm, unfrozen springhead in the wintertime, it might be a good place to go look for some things like snails or insects, because they're probably resting there because it's good habitat and they don't have to worry about freezing at all. All right. So one of the coolest things you can look for in the wintertime in the mountains are mammals. And mammals have a wide variety of survival strategies in the wintertime. But let's take a look at two very different species when it comes to winter survival. On the left, we have the Appalachian cottontail, which is built for the mountain winters. And you can see its range. That's pretty much the only place it lives. The little colored intershaded spots on the map, the counties where it occurs. And they're fairly common on Roan Mountain, even though they're a very range restricted species. So you can go up on the mountain on a summer morning and usually find quite a few sitting along the Appalachian Trail or chasing each other out on the balds. But they're a beautiful small little rabbit with short ears, dark fur, but they just survive the winter by living like they normally do. If they can't find any green plants to eat under the snow, they start eating bark and tree buds. So they're able to survive just about any kind of winter weather, just because that's how they do it. Appalachian cottontails are extremely resilient in that area. But on the other hand, we have Virginia possum, which is not cold resistant at all. And you see it's continually expanding its range farther and farther north from the little map below it. And that's because they have a hard time withstanding cold temperatures. So they'll actually get frostbite and sometimes go into an almost catatonic state when they've been exposed to cold temperatures. And you'll find them sleeping in a trash can or in a tree hole, and they'll almost seem frozen. And they do freeze to death on occasion, especially high up in the mountains when one wanders up there to find surplus food in the summertime and doesn't quite make it out of the Roan Mountain Massif in the wintertime. But there's still quite a few up in the mountains, and they are able to survive. But a lot of times that means that on a kind of overcast day that's really cold, they sometimes have to go out anyway, like this one did, and forage, even though they're mainly nocturnal, because they don't have a choice. If they stop eating, their metabolism gets the best of them and they don't make it. So it's a constant race against these winter temperatures for a possum. And even though they look all woolly and fuzzy and like they would be very warm, that's all just loose, grizzled hair. That doesn't really keep them warm like the cottontail's fur will. But yet both the Appalachian cottontail and the Virginia possum live right beside each other in some of these areas. So two very different stories. The Appalachian cottontail is just sitting there unbothered while the possum has to continue looking for food. But both survive and both have their own roles in the ecosystem. So let's take a look at a couple tracks. And this is a recording of the presentation, not the one that I had a couple days ago. But we're going to take a look at these tracks, and I want you to try to guess for a second what these tracks are. You see they're going across the log, something that can climb pretty well and cross over surfaces. You can see they've got 5 toes. It's a common raccoon, and I'll go to this next slide, and you can see these are another winter animal that's very active, and they are kind of like a possum. They're not the most cold resistant animal, but they're a considerable level above a possum when it comes to winter survival. So they're actually pretty adept to surviving the winter. A lot of people think that they hibernate, but they don't. A lot of our native mammals in the Southern Appalachians don't hibernate at all because they can go out in the wintertime and there are warm enough days to find food. And there's a lot of food that doesn't quite go as dormant as it would in boreal Canadian winters. But Roan Mountain is so similar to those really high elevation places in a lot of the Southern Appalachian highlands that you'll all of a sudden find that our wildlife survives in a similar manner to the wildlife in Canada in a lot of cases. And a lot of those species that live up there are able to survive, or some variation of them is able to survive in our area too. But raccoons are one of the most adept species at surviving mountain winters, and they're very numerous too, so you can kind of tell that. All right, so when you're looking at animal tracks, there's a really important factor to remember. Tracks are giving you a snapshot in not just one animal's life and to tell you, oh, look, a raccoon walked over that log. What tracks tell you are a story. They tell you a detailed natural history story about that moment in time in the forest, that one particular moment, the night before you walked out on that trail and found the tracks, or maybe a predator-prey interaction, or even something just as simple as what the animal is doing and why it was moving around. Like, for example, on the left, you see a trail of bobcat tracks going across bare ground. And on the right, you actually see, excuse me, you see a line of red fox tracks, which it kind of seems opposite because you think of a dog walking on the ground and a cat maybe walking along something that's like a wall or a log. But no, foxes are quite agile creatures. Gray foxes can even climb trees, but red foxes don't hesitate at all about getting on surfaces like this. But that's another story. But the bobcat walking across the ground is a good indication of either hard-packed snow, shallow snow, or warm snow. An animal doesn't usually want to walk on a cold day through deep snow. It takes a lot more energy to try to walk through deep snow. So these fox tracks here, even though it wasn't terribly deep snow, it was very cold, and there were about 2 or 3 inches still left on the ground, even after a bit of it had melted by the time I got there and found the tracks. So you'll notice that the foxes will actually it's using that log as a way to walk on a surface that doesn't have as much piled up snow, because a lot of that snow continues falling over off the sides once it gets too heavy. So it's a lot better to walk on a solid surface like a log than trying to trudge through snow on the ground sometimes, especially through a snowdrift. The bobcat, on the other hand, was on these were on a very warm day after a warm night. As the snow was melting, it was shallow, it was warm. The bobcat would have no problem crossing this snow. And they understand that. It was actually able to cross the trail and head up to a Christmas tree farm where it probably was hunting for rodents and other pests that were living up there, which is kind of cool. But anyway, you can learn a lot about what an animal's doing by following its trail of tracks and seeing where they are. So here's another track, and you can take a minute to guess these. If you notice, the tracks that are zoomed in look very strange. I'll give you a hint, they're hoofed, but they look a little bit unusual compared to whatever hoofed animal you might expect to see in the Southern Appalachians. But actually, they're just plain old white-tailed deer. And white-tailed deer normally have these beautiful, delicate little crescent-shaped hoof prints in the snow or in the mud. But the tracks that I showed you are kind of mean because they're not like that. But actually, bucks, adult male deer, will have these big, goofy-looking tracks. They look like a cartoon drawing of a deer track. Same, basic structure, but they don't look nearly as delicate and detailed as a doe, and that's one of the ways you can tell the difference. But these two does were actually crossing Carver's Gap after a rough night of wind and snow and hoarfrost in the snow. At times, I measured it in one place. It was a snowbank, so you'll have to I don't know, think what you will about that, but it was close to 3 feet in depth. And these deer were actually walking across the balds in that deep, deep, cold snow, eating the buds off of all of these little plants and trees. You have to be ingenuitive to survive mountain winters, but you'll notice too, if you're following a trail of deer tracks through the snow, you'll notice that they also have a higher metabolism in the cold to keep going. So there are a whole lot more deer pellets and scat as they go along the trail, and it's kind of nasty, but it's an interesting concept of the deer having to do that a lot more, and you can really learn a lot about their life history by following the places that they go, because different throughout a day, a herd of deer or even just a small group like these two will cover a lot of ground, and you can learn kind of where they want to be at a particular time of day. So they're very fascinating, wonderful animals to take a look at. Here's some more tracks, and these are kind of confusing because they're old and there was a lot of wind on this day, but you can see it's bounding. It's something that's bounding through the snow. Rabbit tracks do that a lot. Mouse tracks do that a lot. But this particular animal is the North American red squirrel. And red squirrels are arboreal species. I mentioned earlier some of the species we find in the Southern Appalachians resemble those far northern species that live in much colder winters than here. But red squirrels are one of those animals. And these are amazing at surviving the winter. They are some of the toughest little creatures imaginable. They usually live much higher in the mountains than gray or fox squirrels, the other two native squirrel species or tree squirrel species here. But they're much smaller. They're in the genus Tamiascurus, which means chipmunk squirrel. And if you see one up on the mountain, then you'll know why they're called that. But they're constantly getting food. There's an old legend that says they'll cut a pine cone off of a tree branch, and they'll be able to get down to the bottom of the tree and catch it by the time it hits the ground. And I doubt the merit of that old saying, but it's definitely the truth that they constantly and consistently forage for food at all times of the year. So red squirrels are very aggressive, territorial, constantly looking for food. But some of the ways that they will harvest food, they're big fans of conifer trees. That's mainly where they live. They'll live in a conifer forest. So you find a big stand of hemlocks or white pines or red spruce or Fraser fir, hint, hint, like up on the top of the mountain. You usually find a lot of red squirrels. And by a lot, I mean a lot. Sometimes many of these squirrels can be in the same tree hole in the wintertime, and they'll be working together to find food. And what they'll do is they'll find usually a place on the ground, and they'll make a cache of all the pine or spruce cones that they are able to harvest in the fall. And they'll lay them out in this huge hulking pile, and they'll open them up individually and get the tiny little pine nuts out and eat them. And they can store a lot of pine cones. They'll also, in the summertime, take mushrooms, and they'll snip them with their little teeth, and they'll carry them up into a tree, and they'll skewer them on sticks, and they'll store and dry mushrooms so that they can go back and eat little dried mushrooms later. And usually if you're on a hike in the woods, it looks like somebody stabbed a mushroom on a tree branch because they were bored on a hike or something. But it's actually red squirrels most of the time who will take these mushrooms up in the trees and kind of wedge them between branches. They'll wedge them on the branches, and you'll find those little storage areas or drying racks that the squirrels will make to eat mushrooms later. I've wondered how many of those mushrooms actually make it into the winter, but it at least gives them enough food to go back to while they're harvesting other food for the winter. But they do all kinds of crazy stuff like that to make sure that they get enough food in the wintertime. They're also famous for the sounds they make. They make these crazily complex chatter up in the trees when they see you coming. And it gives them the name mountain boomer because they make those booming noises. So you might have heard them referred to as that. But that's a mountain boomer if you ever hear about somebody talking about one. But as the tracks in the snow suggest, they don't slow down in the wintertime at all. They think, these Tennessee or North Carolina winters are a breeze because they could normally handle much colder temperatures. So they're one of our best winter survivors as far as mammals go. And then I won't make you guess these tracks, but these are ruffed grouse tracks. And you see how they're kind of spread out and splayed. Ruffed grouse have pectinations on their feet, which are these little rubbery fringes that allow them to walk across snow like snowshoes. And another animal has that, the snowshoe hare, which used to live on Roan Mountain, but it's probably been extirpated now for a variety of reasons. Um, but several animals that live in the far north, ruffed grouse is one of them. They follow kind of a similar range to the red squirrel. Ruffed grouse coming down in the mountains from Canada or the Rockies and stuff. But ruffed grouse, um, they walk across the snow and they use that uh, those pectinations to stay atop really, really, really deep snow. And so they're very adept at winter survival as well. And you can kind of tell the tracks because they're these odd chicken-like bird tracks just going right atop of the snow like it's nothing. So they're amazing survivors in the wintertime as well. Now I'll tell you one more mammal story. The eastern red bat it's hard to find their tracks in the snow, but these are large bats that live up in the mountains. They actually, a lot of them migrate from the boreal forest of Canada like a bird down into Tennessee to spend the winter. Tennessee's kind of a bat hibernation capital with limestone caves further down the mountain, but these don't need limestone caves. These are kind of solitary bats a lot of the time. They'll live with each other in bat houses or in caves in the summertime or tree crevices, but they can be very solitary. And in the wintertime, instead of finding a limestone cave, they'll go down into into a big leaf pile, or after in the fall when all the leaves have fallen, and they'll dive down into a leaf pile. And that, if you see, normally bats have all that weird hairless membrane going between their back legs and their tail, but they have furry membrane back there. And what they'll do is they'll pull that over around their body and curl up in it like a wool blanket. And they can actually use that blanket to handle the winter temperatures and survive very cold weather without having to go much farther underground or under big boulders and rock outcrops. Sometimes they do because they have to retreat, but they still avoid using those limestone caves most of the time. And that's actually given them a resistance to white nose syndrome, which is a deadly disease that's been killing off a lot of bats. It's actually transmitted by humans, and they can avoid that, unlike a lot of other bat species, which have almost been driven to extinction in some cases because of this weird fungal disease that's going around. So red bats are able to be immune to that because they don't associate with these other bats that carry it into the caves with them. So eastern red bats are actually doing quite well in the mountains compared to other bat species. And you can usually see them flying around even on a warm winter day because, they have to eat too. They'll wake up and people say, oh no, it's a bat with rabies. Rabid bats are actually pretty rare. And usually a bat you'll see flying around in the wintertime on a warm day is a red bat that woke up to look for insects that got warmed up by the sun as well. And you see them dancing through the sky. And you can usually get a lot of really good pictures sometimes of red bats flying through the air because they come out in the daytime. You wouldn't normally be able to see or observe a bat like that in the wild because it's dark. You wouldn't be able to see all their details and all of their neat little flight patterns and see really how a bat survives without that neat little attribute red bats have of being able to wake up in the wintertime. Other bats kind of just live down in the caves where it's warm and come back out and up into the mountains in the summertime. So they give you kind of a neat window into bat life history if you get out on the right day. All right. So another phenomenon that's happening right now in the woods is the amphibian migration. And so, excuse me, amphibians have what's called a high site fidelity. A lot of these amphibians that come out in the late winter time, but they actually come to a specific pond or vernal pool. A vernal pool dries up in most of the season, but it's full of water early in the spring. But they'll come back to these ponds where they were born. And some of these species include the wood frog, which is right here. And wood frogs actually have a really unique life history. Like in the insects we talked about, they can produce antifreeze inside of their body as well, a very similar sugar-based antifreeze that they can actually freeze almost solid and slow or shut down almost everything that's going on in their body and just shut it down. And they sit in the leaf litter and freeze over. You can find them with ice crystals over their head and stuff. It's creepy, but they're able to survive. They wake up in the February rains, and they go waddling down to the ponds where they breed. And they live on land, unlike their relatives like bullfrogs and green frogs that live in the pond and go and brumate or hibernate down under the mud in the wintertime and wake up on these warm days. But these actually move from the forests, the upland forests, back down into the woods to breed at these special ponds and pools. And they'll show up usually to a pond that is without fish because they'll eat the eggs. But they'll come to these ponds and they'll blow out their sides and inflate their sides instead of a throat pouch like a normal frog. And they'll sit there in the water and you'll hear this crackling noise. It's this loud, weird chorus of all these little crackling noises. And keep an ear out for it because it's pretty distinctive. It's hard for me to describe it a better way than just it's wild. Or do a Google search and listen for it. But it's almost hard to notice in some situations unless you really know what to listen for. But once you do notice it, it's very loud. But it's inconspicuous, but very loud. And you can go down to a pond and they're kind of shy and skittish. Sometimes you can get a glimpse of how many there are. They all just come into the pond and start laying eggs, and these big masses of gelatinous eggs. And of course, they're big, huge rounds of tadpoles appear later in the year. But usually the babies are usually, or I'm saying babies, but the froglets, the tiny miniatures of the adults that show up after the tadpoles mature, grow legs, and come onto land. Those younger frogs will show up earlier than most other species because they breed so early in the year. The vernal pools will dry up, keep the late season frogs like green frogs and bullfrogs from laying their eggs in there. So they've got that neat little niche. They get there before any other species and they're able to use that habitat. So it's usually a monopoly. If you find a little vernal pool, a lot of the tadpoles that you'll find in there are wood frog tadpoles. Wood frogs are accompanied by their very, very similar amphibian relative, which is the spotted salamander. It has very similar life history, except rather than coming from the top of the ground in the leaf litter and hopping down to the pond, these live under the ground for most of the year. They aren't really able to freeze solid. Instead, they live down in tunnels underground. And the adults, and so these beautiful adult spotted salamanders will actually crawl into the ponds, and you can find them crossing roads sometimes on a rainy February night. And if you really want to get a good look at them, find an old country road where there might be a little bit of traffic, but not anything too dangerous. And you can actually go drive along the road or walk along the road with a flashlight and find these salamanders as they're crossing the road. And they're big salamanders, they're about 8 inches long. They're adorable, but you can help them across the road to their vernal pools without getting hit by, to prevent them from getting hit by a car, because populations can be pretty fragile at times, and losing a couple of the older adults can kind of decimate it. So these spotted salamanders come to the pools as well, and you can also really help them out by doing something like that. Of course, make sure you're staying safe and watching out for traffic. But you can do a lot of good by helping salamanders. There's a lot of fun too. But they lay these very different abnormal gelatinous, it almost looks like a sea sponge or something attached to a stick. And these eggs actually have a symbiotic relationship with algae. And over time, they turn from this transparent or translucent, whitish or clear egg mass to a green egg mass, because there's a symbiotic algae that is actually inside of the eggs protecting the embryos, and it's getting energy from the sun, and it's actually helping produce a toxin to protect the eggs from predators or anything invading that situation. So it's actually a plant that's connected to this animal and helping it grow via photosynthesis. So in a way, you can almost say that baby spotted salamanders are photosynthetic before they hatch. But after they hatch, they look like that little guy below the picture of the eggs. They have big gills and they're tiny, and then they grow and they grow and they grow. They emerge as a little tiny salamander once again in midsummer, and they go back underground, and then the next year they'll usually come back to the breeding pond. If they're too young or too small to breed quite yet, they'll usually even then come with the other adults to just kind of check out and scout out around the breeding pond. And you can find those little tiny young individuals as well. But anyway, what about the other salamanders? We have a huge diversity of salamanders in the Southern Appalachians, but spotted salamanders are kind of unique in that they're a mole salamander in the genus Ambystoma, which means they can go down underground. And excuse me, that's a lot of other salamanders aren't quite that adept at digging. For example, the Yanalasi salamander, and the northern red salamander. So northern red salamanders, I mentioned earlier, the springs that bring things up into those little headwaters that don't really freeze. Red salamanders are awesome at burrowing, but they usually hang out at the surface of those springs, waiting for other animals that are trying to find some shelter back in those little headwaters, and they'll eat them as they show up. They eat a lot of earthworms, and you see them eat. They'll actually eat a lot of other salamanders too, especially little dusky salamanders and redback stuff like that. They just swallow those things up. They're big too. They're almost spotted salamander size. So around 5-6 inches a lot of times, and a beautiful animal. But they're kind of vicious too. They look like a hot dog crossing a road a lot of times. They're just such a bright orange, out of place thing. A lot of people and herpetologists will call these guys gummy lizards because they look so fake. They look like a fake candy lizard or something. But anyway, that's how they survive. Our more fragile, tiny salamanders that have all these beautiful colors and are generally are the ecologically the most fragile. They they have to go underground in tunnels of other animals like shrews and stuff like that. But they're very temperature sensitive. As soon as it warms up, they can come right back up to the surface. And they're able to have such a great diversity in the Southern Appalachians because we don't get the same deep freezes as there are up north. We have the same habitat. A lot of the other diversity, like insects and stuff, that are a little bit better at surviving, feed these salamanders. So we have this huge biomass of salamanders. There are more, the weight of all the salamanders in this, in 1 acre of forest up in the mountains is usually going to be outweigh all the other vertebrate animals like the birds, the bears. If you were to put them all on a scale, um, that's a pretty impressive aspect of Southern Appalachian wildlife. But they're able to use that insect diversity to feed on while it's the warm season. But in the wintertime, they'll also pop up and act like everything's normal on a day that's like 50 degrees. You think, oh, it's a beautiful winter day. Let's go outside and check things out. You flip a log and you see the same salamanders as you saw in the summer. You can do that in a lot of North Carolina and Tennessee just because they're hardy enough to be able to withstand that. Even sometimes if there's snow on the ground, if you pick up a rock or a log, you can see a peek into that underground world where they're waiting for the excuse me, frost and snow to subside. And then one more salamander is the red-spotted newt, which is an old world salamander. It's different than all the other native salamanders, basically. So they start out as the beautiful little red eft you see in the summertime, which has an awesome life history story. But the adults are the really cool thing to focus on the winter time. If you go to a pond, there's a little pond at the Miller Farmstead up on Roan Mountain that used to be a good place to see them. It's kind of gotten low now, but if you go to a pond up on the mountain, you can usually find these red-spotted newt adults, which are in the water, have a big paddle-shaped tail. They'll be swimming under the ice and battling with each other, mating, laying eggs. You can watch their whole life history through the window of glass that's actually the ice on top of the water. So you can see them just swimming through there, and it's amazing to watch them just effortlessly cruise under the ice in freezing cold water. It seems like they're unbothered, but salamanders can handle pretty cold temperatures. Many of them can't really freeze, but if the temperature gets much above 70 or 80 degrees, especially down in their burrows, they can have a really hard time surviving because a lot of pathogens are ready to attack them. And that's a big story about how they manage to survive hot temperatures, and cold temperatures, but they do it, and they do it almost flawlessly. And it's really amazing to see how well they can survive. So now let's take a look at a reptile. And this is the only really, really, really common reptile that you can find up on the mountain that you can kind of reliably go out there and track down on a spring or summer day. This is eastern garter snake. And up in the mountains, we actually have garter snakes that are a lot darker. And one hypothesis for that, if you live in Johnson City, or I'm thinking of places west of the Appalachian in Tennessee mostly, a lot of the North Carolina highlands are pretty much have garter snakes that look a lot like this. But these areas have traditional eastern garter snakes that you find up in the mid-Atlantic states. And in the pictures that you see in field guides, they're going to look a lot more like these. They're just yellow stripe, black stripe, yellow stripe, black stripe, yellow stripe. our mountain garter snakes are all these colors of brown. I've even seen blue and reds on some of these really beautiful mountain garter snakes, but they're a lot darker. And the hypothesis is not only help them blend in, but it also helps them survive colder mornings when they have to slither out of their burrow and warm up, because they thermoregulate. They have to adjust to the temperature of their environment. And they do, and like most snakes, they do a lot better at warm temperatures. But these actually breed in the winter time. If that isn't crazy, they love warm temperatures, but the time that they have to go find mates is not warm. They find a warm day in February, and by a warm day in February, I mean it's above freezing, the sun's out, and it's dry to some extent. So that when they come out in these warm winter days, they'll actually sorry, lost my train of thought. They'll come out on these warm winter days, and a bunch of them will gather outside of what's called a hibernacula, which is a big collective hibernation spot. It could be over a big boulder, a big overhang. It could be under anything like that, somewhere that they can get away from the cold temperatures and survive. And they'll come out there and they'll form a huge big ball of snakes. And in Canada and places where it's really, really cold and there's really no other snake species but garter snakes, you can see even videos of even bigger masses or stuff online if you want to look for them. But in Roan Mountain, you still see this phenomenon happen with these really cool mountain garter populations of garter snakes. And so they pop out of the burrows and they do that. And they're also pretty adept at hunting at colder temperatures. They can slither down into streams. This one was actually found in late November on a very, very cold, almost freezing day, hunting salamanders in a little spring on the mountain. So they're definitely a very cool animal. So let's talk about another plant. When you cross into mountain, excuse me, just below the spruce fir forest, you can find the American beech. And these beech forests are very distinct and beautiful, but beech trees actually communicate with each other. They have intertwined roots, basically form colonies. You have all these beech trees that are intertwined, and if there's a pest or a pathogen or even temperature changes, if one gets eaten by a deer, they can communicate with each other through the roots to some extent by exchanging chemical signals. So it's really amazing when you walk through one of those forests in the wintertime on the mountain, you can actually see that very distinct connection between all of the trees and how they survive. The leaves are still attached to the branches in the wintertime as well to protect the tree buds from things like deer. So it's definitely something you want to pay attention to if you're out in the wintertime, because they look very pretty. They look like a golden brown, like a well-roasted marshmallow. And the whole forest does with these leaves that are left over, especially late in the fall. They're a beautiful tree and they've got a really cool life history. But some other plants that are really unique in the wintertime are witch hazel, which blooms in the wintertime, and flies that happen to come out on warm days, the same stuff that the red bat would eat and that salamanders might eat. Those flies are able to pollinate witch hazel. Since it's the only thing blooming, it doesn't really have a whole lot of competition. So it's the only really bright yellow blossom that's out there. So all kinds of things flock to it. You can find some really unique winter adult insects that are landing on those flowers and pollinating them. Mostly flies, but flies can be very strange because there are thousands and thousands of species of them. American hazelnut, they have little nuts encased in a sheath of dead leaves that are growing on the bush, and big, huge buds. So a lot of hazelnut's very important, and a lot of trees that produce mast or hard nuts in the wintertime are really important. Of course, squirrels gather them, bears gather them, and deer feed on a lot of these nuts in the wintertime as well. Even blue jays and corvids like crows and or other corvids, blue jays or corvids, like crows and ravens will bust open these hazelnuts and acorns and such in the wintertime. And that's something to look out for as well. Eastern wintergreen actually has little fruits in the wintertime. They have their leaves will sometimes turn from this glossy, waxy green to red. Sometimes they'll stay green, but you can see a lot of the red in the stalk and stuff in the photo. But those are anthocyanins, and that's a red pigment that actually protects the trees and the leaves from really, really excruciatingly cold temperatures, because they have that extra guard of that pigment. And so wintergreen, we'll use that sometimes. But most of the time, like the beech tree, it's colonial. All the little trees are connected. They are basically a tree. They're related to rhododendrons, but they're only about 6 inches tall, and they grow up out of the ground. They have these tiny little waxy. It's a beautiful, beautiful plant, but you can eat these berries, and they're where wintergreen flavoring comes from. And you can chew on a little wintergreen berry. There's not much chewing, but it tastes like wintergreen gum or something if you're up in the mountains in the wintertime. And of course, something like a ruffed grouse would love to eat one of these berries, especially on a cold day when there's not much else out there. All right, so moving on from plants, now let's look into the Doe River. The Doe River has a really amazing diversity of fish species. If you ever get a chance to swim there, I recommend putting on a pair of swimming goggles or a snorkel and start going through the water and investigating. Actually, at the kids' rally in the summertime, the Extreme Roan Adventures, they do a big snorkeling thing there. And you can go down in the water and you can actually see, that's a shameless plug for the Extreme Roan Adventures, but you can go down into the water and look for these amazingly ornate fish, like war paint shiners. They have the war paint on their face. It's absolutely beautiful. And they swim in huge schools and they follow. You see those other fish in the picture with them are river chubs. And river chubs will build these big stone nests, but all these fish live in here. And in the summertime, you can see them swimming in the water, and it's just this myriad of colors and all different shapes and sizes. On the bottom, you have things like the snub-nosed darter, which is a very fast little skittish fish with all these rainbow colors, and they put on these wild displays, and males battle each other. The banded sculpin, it looks like a sea creature because it has this huge gaping mouth and huge fins it sits on the bottom with. And anytime a little fish like a shiner or a dace swims overhead, they jump up and eat it. And even brook trout and introduced brown and rainbow trout also live in the Doe River. So if you go up in the Doe River in the wintertime, it's very different. Instead of this cool, crisp water coming down off the mountain with minnows and salamanders and everything living there and mayflies flying above it, you instead get this half-frozen wasteland of barren rocks with water currents just rushing by. And it's hard to find life a lot of times if you go up there in the wintertime by just looking into the river. But everything's still there. Fish can't just fly south. They probably wish they could, but instead they'll go deep down into the pools. And a lot of things like larger trout, they're probably just going to have to stay alive and go down below the freezing zone, and they just kind of slow down and stop eating a lot of the times and just kind of wait it out on the bottom. But these little fish that live way farther up in the mountain than we might expect them to, they can actually go down in little clusters of leaves and leaf piles behind eddies, where an eddy kind of creates a little whirlpool and erodes out the rock and piles up dirt and debris. They can go and sneak down in there without the fall leaves that float into the stream and into the river. They would have a very hard time surviving the winter, at least farther up on the mountain in places that they do. So it's very important to have all these leaves and things in the water, and also larval insects feed on those too to feed the fish. So you get this whole cycle. Fall turns into winter, but the winter is still using what's happening in the fall, as we've seen in some other cases ecologically. So you get these awesome fish kind of living there and benefiting off of those leaf piles. But that's where they go. It seems invisible, especially if you're out there trying to fish, but they're just moving to a different habitat. They're not as mobile in the winter as they would typically be in the summertime or spring. Spring's one of the best times to see. So I kind of want to leave you with this last slide, which is just a myriad of very strange little things that you can find if you happen to be out in the winter forest. You can see a little mucor fungus. They have these little water droplet-like heads that pop up out of decaying organic matter and create these beautiful little sculptures of tiny, I guess you could call them mushrooms. They're fungus fruiting bodies, but they're growing off of the surface. It's really fun to take a little bit of pond water or some kind of water from a vernal pool and put it on a microscope slide and take a look at it. You find this stuff like this little amoeba that has a shell around it called Arcella dentata that lives in sphagnum bogs and sphagnum moss. And then you have tiny little micro snails and stuff like this you overlook in the summertime. There's too much exciting stuff, uh, like salamanders and um, well, you can find salamanders in the winter, but of course it's going to be a lot easier in the summertime. But there are going to be all kinds of wildlife, wildflowers, butterflies that are going to be active in the summertime. They're going to be showing off, and you won't really pay attention to a lot of this stuff most of the time if there's all that other stuff right in your face. So winter's a good time. I know I wouldn't, but in winter's a good time to kind of get down and look at some of this tiny, intricate stuff in nature, like snaggletooth snails, for example. They look like a seashell, except they're little tiny, transparent, 1 or 2 millimeter long snails that um, live in the soil. Wild stonecrop, it's a native succulent. You see the anthocyanin and red pigment in the leaves to keep them from freezing, but it's a native mountain succulent that grows on mossy rocks. The American myrmecina, this is a little hairy ant that goes away from the colony of just a few individuals and a queen for days at a time, venturing across the forest floor far from the colony in the winter, freezing over sometimes, having to find little crevices in the bark, but then it'll continue moving and hunt things like springtails to bring back to its colony. So very unique little stories. And Asa gray scalewort, it looks like a bunch of jelly beans stuck together, and it grows up way up on top of Roan Mountain in the wintertime. So you get all this really wonderful biodiversity that you would normally overlook in the winter. So, all right, I'll end on this picture of a raven. Hope you learned something. Hope you enjoyed it. This will be posted on the Friends of Roan Mountain website, and you can see in the picture, it's a common raven, and common ravens are awesome winter survivors as well. This one was on a very chilly winter afternoon as it was starting to warm up. This raven was flying over the mountain, and ravens will sometimes follow humans, especially hunters, or in medieval times, the militaries that were going across the country because they knew that there was going to be carrion. They do it with wolves all the time, but it just flew down. I don't think it was expecting me to kill something and bring it up there because it's so used to hikers, and so I don't think it was trying to steal food from me, but it was curious, and it just flew by on a cold winter day through the wind, through the freezing ice crystals in the air, and it was able to survive, and it's able to survive that. So keep an eye out this winter for some beautiful natural history stories you can find out in the woods, and hopefully you can see some of this stuff in person. Thanks for watching.